good. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us for our 2021 Evacuation Day lecture with J.L. Bell. Today marks 1 year since the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic, and through the immense challenges of the past year, it is so gratifying to see more of you than ever tuning in for opportunities to continue to gather with this community and learn and connect virtually. So thank you to the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters for supporting this event and many others at the site. We don't know just yet what the upcoming season at the Longfellow House will entail, but we do look forward to continuing to gather virtually like we're doing tonight, including for our upcoming Summer Poetry Festival in partnership with the New England Poetry Club and the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters. So please join us on social media to stay up to date on virtual readings and discussions and more. Before we begin tonight, just a bit of Zoom etiquette, though at this point, probably much of this is old hat. We're recording tonight's program and do plan to make it available on our YouTube channel. So again, if your camera's on, you will be visible in the recording. Up to you, you might wish to turn it off. Please do stay on mute throughout the presentation so that John can be heard. However, in the second half of the program, we are going to open it up for questions. So please, as the presentation is going on, put those questions into the chat box and we'll have some conversation later on. If anyone does have technical issues, I'm standing by to try to help you out. So you can send a message through the chat box to the organizers and I will see what I can do. All right, so for many years now, around Evacuation Day, J.L. Bell has spoken at Washington's headquarters about some aspect of the site's history during the American Revolution. In fact, his talk on Native Americans in the Siege of Boston was our last in-person program in March 2020. But we and John didn't want to interrupt that tradition, and so this year when he proposed adapting one of his talks for this online medium, we were really thrilled to take him up on it. J.L. Bell is the proprietor of the Boston 1775 blog, offering daily helpings of history, analysis, and unabashed gossip about revolutionary New England, and it's a favorite of many of the staff here at Longfellow House. He is also the author of The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, as well as a book-length study for the National Park Service on General George Washington's time here at the House, and many articles and papers. John is also the part-time administrator of the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters. So you've seen him welcoming people to in-person events and co-hosting some of our virtual events. So now I'm very pleased to welcome John Bell back virtually to Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you to the National Park Service for all their support and to the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, and to the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati for supporting research and talks like this. Tonight's story, I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Tonight's story of the End of Tory Row is from the perspective of the big yellow Georgian mansion built before the Revolution along the road from Cambridge to Watertown. And I'm speaking, of course, of Elmwood. It was one end of the historic neighborhood that's called Tory Row. And I'm going to look at events through the eyes of its first owner, a man named Thomas Oliver. Thomas Oliver was from a wealthy family in Dorchester. They gained their money from a slave labor plantation in Antigua in the Caribbean. Thomas Oliver was born on that island in 1734. The family moved to Massachusetts when Thomas was just 4. The Olivers were Anglican, seeing the king as the head of their church. Their wealth depended on the British trading system, and so they were natural friends of the royal government. Thomas Oliver went to Harvard, class of 1753. He became, as one historian later said, a dapper little man, pleasant of speech and courtly of manner. In 1760, he married a young woman named Elizabeth Vassall. Her family also got its money from Caribbean sugar plantations. In the Vassalls' case, from plantations on Jamaica. If you were a very rich Anglican who wanted to marry within your class and religion, New England didn't give you a very wide choice of mate. So Thomas Oliver found Elizabeth Vassall, and in fact, 7 months later, Thomas's sister married Elizabeth's brother, John Vassall. Thomas's sister was also named Elizabeth, which meant that Miss Elizabeth Vassall became Mrs. Elizabeth Oliver, and Miss Elizabeth Oliver became Mrs. Elizabeth Vassall. John Vassall took his bride to the mansion he had built in Cambridge, the big gray house with a very large estate down to the river and on every side. And in 1770, we know that John Vassall paid more property taxes to the town of Cambridge than anybody else. So he had the biggest estate in town. Today, that house is even bigger, though the estate is smaller, and we know it as Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. Thomas and Elizabeth Oliver must have enjoyed visiting the Vassalls because they decided to move from Dorchester into Cambridge. Thomas also gave money to help build a new Anglican church in Cambridge. He and Elizabeth had their first daughters baptized there even before they moved into town. So they were putting down roots in Cambridge, and then in 1766, Thomas commissioned a house in that neighborhood of his in-laws, half a mile west along the Charles River. Elmwood has often been said to have been designed by the architect Peter Harrison of Newport. There's not really evidence for that. It may just be a standard Georgian house plan. We do know that a local housewright named John Nutting helped to build it. And we also know from town records that Thomas Oliver paid almost as much real estate tax as his brother-in-law, John Vassall. So he was also a very rich landowner. As you can see from this map printed in 1777, the Oliver's house was on the main road to Watertown. Now, this map, the north is off to the right, west is at the top. So today, Brattle Street cuts straight to the Mount Auburn Cemetery gate, but back in the 1770s, it curved along the river. So Thomas Oliver's house, now called Elmwood, was still on the main road back then. Almost all of the neighbors along that stretch of road were Elizabeth Oliver's relatives. There was her paternal aunt, Susanna, who married the retired sea captain, George Ruggles, and they lived in this handsome Georgian mansion as it looks today. There was Elizabeth's maternal aunt, Rebecca Phipps, who married a local merchant and politician named Joseph Lee. And in 1758, Lee bought this house, which was originally built way back in 1684. The previous owner had fixed it up to look more fashionable, to look more like the new Georgian mansions, though to my eyes, it just doesn't quite have the right proportions. They were trying their best. Then there was Elizabeth's maternal aunt Mary, who married the merchant Richard Leechmere. They lived at this site beside what is now the Armenian church. The house survives, but it's been moved to a new place and altered, and it's keeping a low profile with no blue oval. So I'm going to be showing the blue oval that shows where it used to be. Then, moving closer to Cambridge, there was the estate of John and Elizabeth Vassall and their children. And then a little bit closer to town, on the other side of the road, was the home of Elizabeth's paternal uncle Henry and his wife Penelope. Elizabeth's maternal uncle David Phipps lived elsewhere in Cambridge. In fact, he was the royal sheriff of Middlesex County. And close to Harvard College was Elizabeth's paternal aunt Anna. She had married a merchant named John Borland, and they moved into this house in 1765. The Borland's house had actually been originally built for a man named Reverend East Apthorpe, a son of an immensely wealthy Boston merchant, also with money from Caribbean sugar plantations. He had gone to Britain to study, and he had taken holy orders in the Church of England, and then he was sent back to be the first minister of Christ Church in Cambridge. Peter Harrison did send plans for this building. It opened for services in 1761. And New England Congregationalists, the heirs of the Puritan tradition, saw it as this direct challenge to Harvard, an attempt by the Church of England to exercise power in America. And then when East Apthorpe commissioned this big house nearby for himself, the locals said it was fancy enough to be a palace, a bishop's palace. This is a cartoon from that period in the early 1760s called An Attempt to Land a Bishop in America. and the locals are pushing the boat with the bishop away from the shore. That shows the level of vituperation that greeted the Reverend East Apthorpe when he tried to become the minister of Christ Church in Cambridge. And eventually that controversy drove Reverend Apthorpe back to England, but the Anglican Church remained. As I said, Oliver supported Christ Church even before he lived in Cambridge. After moving into town, he became a vestryman and later a warden, which were important lay positions in the church. Most of his neighbors along the Watertown Road were also Anglicans. The Church of England was the established church in most of the British Empire, but in the colonies, in other colonies, Anglicans were in the majority, but in New England, founded by Puritans, Anglicans were a minority, and they could feel oppressed or even endangered. But when they had this big church, this community of Anglicans in Cambridge felt that they had an anchor, they had a home. Thomas and Elizabeth eventually had 6 daughters: Anne, Elizabeth, Penelope, Mary, Lucy, and Frances. The Vassals, the other young family on the street, had mostly boys, and we can imagine those cousins growing up together, sometimes playing together, sometimes separately. Baroness Redhazel, a prisoner of war after the Battle of Saratoga, was housed in the Lechmere House, and she heard about this pleasant life along the street from a few years before, and she wrote, "7 families who are connected with each other partly by the ties of relationship and partly by affection, had here farms, gardens, and magnificent houses, and not far off plantations of fruit. The owners of these were in the habit of daily meeting each other in the afternoons, now at the house of one, now at another, and making themselves merry with music and the dance, living in prosperity, united and happy." Now, of course, we have to remember that that lifestyle was based on slavery. Most of those large houses were staffed by enslaved domestic servants. Slaves worked the fields and gardens and orchards around them. All the families received income from Caribbean sugar plantations, and those plantations were somewhere between work camps and death camps. Caribbean planters knew the tropical islands were unhealthy. That's why the families started moving to Boston in the early 1700s. John Vassall visited Jamaica as a young man. Thomas Oliver may have gone back to Antigua for visits as well, but mostly they were absentee owners, managing from a distance and taking the money. Now, there were some changes in the neighborhood after the Olivers arrived in 1765. In 1769, Henry Vassall died, leaving his wife Penelope a widow. By all indications, a happy widow. Their daughter married Dr. Charles Russell of Lincoln, and over the next few years, it looks like Penelope's nephew John across the street bought a lot of her property, both land and human property. So the widow Vassall was doing what today we would call downsizing. 2 years later, the Lechmeres sold their house to Jonathan Sewell. Now, Sewell was from a poor branch of a venerable old Massachusetts family. He was a great friend of John Adams when they were both young lawyers. He married Esther Quincy from a local merchant family, the Quincy's. In the mid-1760s, Sewell wrote newspaper essays supporting the crown, and in return, the governor made him Attorney General of Massachusetts. And later he became a vice admiralty judge, another royal appointment. So when Sewell arrived on the Watertown Road in the Lechmere House, he was a poor boy who had made good, and therefore, compared to the others, nouveau riche. He wasn't an Anglican, he didn't have money from plantations in the Caribbean, but he fit in politically with his neighbors because he had become a loyalist. Those changes in the neighborhood in the late 1760s were minor compared to what happened in 1774. That was the year when this neighborhood changed drastically. Just before that year began, on December 16, 1773, Boston radicals destroyed 3 shiploads of tea. That was a protest and an attempt to block the imperial government's tea tax, which was the latest attempt to raise revenue in the American colonies. And that controversy had no direct effect on the Olivers neighborhood. None of them were involved in the tea or the tea controversy. But on March 7th, 1774, Bostonians destroyed another shipload of tea. News of that event reached London just as Parliament was debating how to respond to the first destruction. And given the new news, is no surprise that the government chose harsh measures. The ministry in London made General Thomas Gage the new governor of Massachusetts. He was already commander-in-chief of the British Army forces in North America, so he was supposed to bring military discipline to this rebellious colony. Gage promised the king and the prime minister that he would govern firmly. In particular, he was to enforce the Boston Port Bill, which forbade all transatlantic trade with Boston until the town repaid the cost of the destroyed tea. Gage arrived in Boston in May 1774, bringing army regiments to help him keep the peace. And on London's orders, he moved the legislature from Boston to Salem. Closing the port affected a lot of Boston merchants, as well as workers in the town. But it probably had a limited effect still on the Olivers neighborhood, because most of those families were still getting their wealth from other parts of the empire. As long as the islands were still producing sugar, it wasn't so important whether it was shipped to Boston or other places. Massachusetts' radical politicians protested the new law. They voted to send delegates to a Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Gage tried to stop them, but he couldn't shut that down in time. Meanwhile, over in London, Parliament was working on a stricter law, a law that would permanently change the Massachusetts government. So here I have to talk about how the Massachusetts government works. The colonial government was a mixture of top-down and bottom-up authority. The top-down authority came from the imperial capital, London. Since 1692, the Crown appointed the province's governors and lieutenant governor. The London government appointed the army and the navy. The London controlled the customs service, which collected the taxes. Meanwhile, New England was organized around small towns, and that was bottom-up authority, or perhaps it's better to say middle-up authority, because, of course, only white men with property could vote. But the franchise was pretty widely distributed by 18th century standards. Town meetings elected selectmen and other town officials once a year. Town meetings elected representatives to the Massachusetts legislature. There were areas of overlap and conflict that were supposed to be kept in balance. For instance, the towns elected representatives, the representatives elected the council. The governor, top down, could veto anybody in the council he didn't want to work with. But once he had a council, he could only take certain actions if the council approved. And the council was also the upper house of the legislature. So the council was a combination of top-down and bottom-up authority. Judges were also top-down authorities. They were appointed by the governor, but juries were bottom-up authorities, and sometimes juries just disregarded what judges told them that they should do. Starting with the Stamp Act of 1765, London tried to strengthen its control over all the North American colonies, and especially over the ones that were most resistant. Massachusetts fought back, hanging a stamp tax collector in effigy, for instance. There were more protests in 1765. There were boycotts. There was the occasional riot. One night early in those Stamp Act protests, as a large crowd marched past the townhouse in Boston, Governor Francis Bernard wanted to call out the militia. Now, the militia was the system of local self-defense. It was separate from the regular military, the Army and the Royal Navy. The law required almost all white men between ages 16 and 60 to serve in the militia. By law, the governor was the commander of the militia. Theoretically, he had the top-down authority to summon those men to put down unrest. But as Governor Bernard's advisors told him on that night in 1765, the men out protesting in the streets were the same men as in the militia. They weren't going to turn out to stop themselves from protesting. There was no way he could force large crowds to obey his orders. The New England militia system was thus in some ways a bottom-up institution. Militiamen elected their own company officers, though the governor appointed the generals and the colonels. The militia was also an avenue for proving oneself and thus climbing in society from bottom or from middle into the upper ranks. And it was also an institution for confirming who was already at the top of the society. like Thomas Oliver. Thomas Oliver became an officer in the Middlesex County Regiment. Rural militiamen often like to elect the richest man in town or one of the rich men in town to be the officers, either out of deference to the upper class or because those men supplied the best banquets on militia training days. Eventually, Oliver was a militia lieutenant colonel under his neighbor, General William Brattle. His vassal relatives also served as colonels for a while. And once you got to be a captain or a major or a colonel, everybody called you by that title for the rest of your life. So he was Colonel Oliver. John Vassal was Lieutenant Colonel, was Major Vassal, and so on. Elizabeth Oliver's uncle, David Phipps, the royal sheriff, he was also in command of the governor's horse guard. But that situation was changing under the new laws, which were changing the balance of how the Massachusetts government worked. In 1774, after the double destruction of the tea, Parliament decided that it had to take more control over Massachusetts. And the result was something called the Massachusetts Government Act. Towns under that law, towns could only hold meetings once a year unless the governor gave them approval in advance. Councilors were no longer being elected from the bottom. They were chosen by officers in London by writs of mandamus, which is a legal term. And that was, the result was called the Mandamus Council or the Newfangled Council. The Massachusetts Government Act arrived in Boston in August 1774, and along with it came some special news for Thomas Oliver. Back in March, Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver had died. The ministry in London appointed Thomas Oliver to succeed him. This was a surprise for everyone. Thomas Oliver was only 40 years old. He had never been politically active. He hadn't run for office. He hadn't written newspaper essays. He hadn't sought political appointments. One newspaper guessed that Thomas was appointed as a favor to a distant cousin, Richard Oliver, who was an alderman and a member of Parliament for London. But that man was one of the few MPs to vote against the Boston Port Bill. So the government wouldn't have given that man any favors. Most people speculated that the Crown had meant to appoint Andrew Oliver's brother, Peter, instead as lieutenant governor. Peter was already the Chief Justice of Massachusetts. Maybe officials in London assumed that Thomas Oliver was part of the same family. In fact, those two Oliver families were not related at all. So it looks like Thomas Oliver of Elmwood became the Massachusetts lieutenant governor just because of a mistake 3,000 miles away. However it happened, on August 8th, Thomas Oliver went to Salem, he met with General Gage, and he was sworn in as the new lieutenant governor. And at the same time, he became a member of the Newfangled Council. Elizabeth's uncle, William Vassal, was also summoned to serve on the council by writ of mandamus, but Uncle William declined because he knew that position was unpopular. Indeed, in Western towns, crowds were stopping men from joining the council, surrounding their houses, trying to threaten them into resigning. Way out in the West, men had also mustered in their militia companies and forced the local judges not to hold court sessions under the Massachusetts Government Act. That movement started a long way from Boston, but it was coming closer as the county courts tried to open closer and closer to Boston. That was the atmosphere in late August 1774 when this man wrote a letter to General Gage. This was William Brattle. He was in his late 60s. He was general in the Massachusetts militia. He also lived along the Watertown Road, closer to the center of Cambridge than the Vassals and the Olivers. In fact, we know his house now as the Cambridge Center for Adult Education. On August 27th, 1774, Brattle wrote a letter from this house. Mr. Brattle presents his duty to Governor Gage. He apprehends it his duty to acquaint his excellency from time to time with everything he hears and knows to be true and is of importance in these troublesome times. Eventually, Brattle got around to a report on the powder house in Charlestown, which now stands today in Somerville. That stone tower was the repository of gunpowder for town militia companies, for the province, even for individuals. And Brattle wrote, "This morning the selectmen of Medford came and received their town stock of powder, which was in the arsenal on Quarry Hill, so that there is now therein the king's powder only, which shall remain there as a sacred depositum until ordered out by the Captain General, His Excellency General Gage." Brattle told the governor that the town militias were taking their gunpowder for whatever reason, and that the province's powder was sitting in that tower unguarded. At the end of August, General Gage decided to make sure that gunpowder couldn't be used against his soldiers. In the words of John Andrews, a Boston merchant, on August 31st, 280 men were drafted from the several regiments on the common, furnished with a day's provision each, to be in readiness to march early in the morning. On September 1st, a sufficient number of boats from the men of war and transports took them on board between 4 and 5 o'clock this morning, and proceeding up Mystic River, landed at the back of Bob Temple's house, from whence they proceeded to the magazine. Sheriff Phipps, who, remember, is Elizabeth Oliver's uncle, had received orders from Gage to open the gunpowder house for them. Soldiers arrived at the powder house before dawn on the 1st. They waited until twilight grew strong enough to see inside, because you don't want to take lanterns into a gunpowder storage house. They took off their boots because they didn't want to strike sparks through their nails on the floor. Once they got inside, they moved 250 half barrels of gunpowder onto 8 wagons. In his diary, Thomas Newell added, "A detachment from this corps went to Cambridge and brought off 2 field pieces." That's 2 cannon. These were about 20 soldiers went to the center of Cambridge and took 2 small cannon that the Middlesex County militia used for training. Some locals saw what was happening. They wanted to stop it, but they couldn't get organized, and you really have to get organized if you're going to stand up to 20 armed soldiers. Those soldiers moved all this ordnance to Castle William, what's now Castle Island. And back then it really was an island, not connected to the mainland. The fort there was totally under the Army's control. That meant that all those weapons were beyond the reach of any locals. Rumors in Boston said that Lieutenant Governor Oliver had helped with this operation, but he never mentioned doing that. So I think those rumors were likely mistaken. I think he was as surprised as everybody else. The operation took fewer than 300 soldiers. It was over by midday. General Gage thought he had regained the upper hand. However, to the populace, the removal of the powder and gun and cannons looked like a strike at their militia, at their self-defense, another branch of their self-government being encroached on, like the town meetings, like the council. So the populace rose up, not from any orders from the top radical leaders. The idea that the royal government was taking away communities' rights rose up from the bottom. It rose up all over Massachusetts. And the first target was William Brattle. Merchant John Andrews wrote, "The governor, walking up the main street to dine with Brigadier Piggott, by chance or design, in pulling out his handkerchief, dropped a letter from Brigadier Brattle of Cambridge." So Brattle's letter was just lying on the street in Boston, reportedly. And by the end of the afternoon of September 1st, people knew that Brattle had drawn Gage's attention to the powder house. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband the next day, "No sooner did Brattle discover his treachery had taken air than he fled, not only into Boston, but into the army camp for safety." Brattle declared that he didn't mean to betray or anger his neighbors, but it was too late. He was never able to go home to Cambridge again. The same crowd then went up the Watertown Road to the house of Jonathan Sewell, the Attorney General. The crowd surrounded this house, shouting for Sewell to come out. In fact, he had already gone into Boston. His wife and his little boys were home, along with some young men, probably recent Harvard graduates. One of them was this man, Ward Chipman, back when he was 20 years old. He was studying law with Jonathan Sewell, possibly also tutoring the boys. And there was a fight between the crowd outside and the young men and an enslaved servant inside. Chapman ended up firing a pistol inside, and that prompted the people outside to break windows in the house. But then it seemed everybody realized, okay, we're going too far here. And the young men went out and said the pistol shot was an accident. And the crowd said that, okay, in exchange for some wine, we won't bother anybody in this neighborhood. And that's how the evening of the 1st of September ended, with the people from Cambridge, young men of Cambridge, going home. But meanwhile, rumors were spreading west and south and getting worse. In Shrewsbury, toward the middle of the state, or the province, people heard the powder was taken, 6 men killed. In Hartford, Connecticut, people heard Brattle at Cambridge. A high Tory had petition Gage for troops to protect him at his house. A mob gathered and demanded of Brattle to renounce his Toryism. But after a short parley, the troop fired, killed some right out, a large number wounded. And by the time the alarm reached Longmeadow, Massachusetts, the news was the ships in the harbor of Boston and the army on the land side were also firing upon the town, so it was like the town was demolished. Men started to gather in their militia companies because they felt that Boston had been attacked by the British military. The Boston Gazette, which is a radical newspaper, spun the story like this: from these several hostile appearances, the county of Middlesex took the alarm, and on Thursday evening, the 1st, began to collect in large bodies with their arms, ammunitions, and provisions, determining by some means to check up to a power which so openly threatened their destruction and in such a clandestine manner robbed them of the means of their defense. The merchant John Andrews marveled, they had an account at Marlborough of the powders being removed last Thursday night, yet they were down to Cambridge, which is 30 miles, by 8 o'clock Friday morning with a troop of horse and another of foot. So there were hundreds of militiamen on the march overnight between the 1st and the 2nd. And when the hundreds of those men came into Cambridge from Watertown, they passed by Lieutenant Governor Thomas Oliver's house. He later wrote, early in the morning of that day, a number of the inhabitants of Charlestown called at my house to acquaint me that a large body of people from several towns in the county were on their way, coming down to Cambridge, that they were afraid some bad consequences might ensue, and begged I would go out to meet them and endeavor to prevail upon them to return. Local men, town officials, members of the Committee of Correspondence, or both, were trying to keep the peace. They assumed that people would listen to a high-ranking gentleman, to the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. Oliver wrote, in a very short time, before I could prepare myself to go, they appeared in sight. The first of hundreds, then thousands of men coming into Cambridge. Now, by then, the crowds had realized that there had been no shooting. Boston was not in ashes. There had not been any cannonade. They had left their firearms at some distance behind them in Watertown or in a yard near the town border under guard. And they advanced to Cambridge armed only with sticks, but they were still coming in their militia units. Oliver said, I went out to them and asked the reasons of their appearance in that manner. They respectfully answered, they came peaceably to inquire into their grievances, not with a design to hurt any man. I perceived that they were the landholders of the neighboring towns and was thoroughly persuaded they would do no harm. Oliver believed that these men were men of property like him and thus respectable. Oliver said he spoke to them in such a manner as I thought best calculated to quiet their minds. They thanked me for my advice, said they were no mob, but sober, orderly people who would commit no disorders, and then proceeded on their way. The crowd began to assemble on the town common. Now, Cambridge Common was considerably larger than it is now. It was lined with elm trees for shade, surrounded by houses and buildings. This is a map of the common drawn by a Harvard College student a few years later during the war. The Boston merchant John Andrews said, at 8 o'clock, there was about 3,000 under their regular leaders at Cambridge and continually increasing. Those men, by saying grouped under their regular leaders, that meant their militia officers. They were keeping their military discipline. Each company chose 1 or 2 men for a committee of the body. So there were now 2 sets of committees. There was the local officials, and then there were the men from the countryside, these ad hoc committees. The crowd waited to hear from the 2 members of the newfangled council who lived nearby. They wanted to hear resignations like those crowds out in the West. One of those men lived out on the Watertown Road. It was Elizabeth Oliver's uncle, Joseph Lee. He was 63 years old, now a local judge. That morning, a man from Lexington had warned him about the crowds coming, and Lee had immediately sat down in his house and wrote out a resignation from the council. The other man was Samuel Danforth, 77 years old. He had been on the council for 35 years, most of his adult life. He was a very learned gentleman. His studies included alchemy. At one point, a few years before, he had written to Benjamin Franklin about the Philosopher's Stone, the legendary key to immortality. And Franklin wrote back that he was looking forward to chatting with Danforth about America's liberty in another 100 years. Danforth had tried to resign from the council the day before, but Governor Gage had refused to accept his resignation. The committee sat down with those two gentlemen in Lee's house, seeking to resolve the situation so that everyone was satisfied, no one was hurt. A new worry arose. How would General Gage react to the assemblage of militiamen? A report arose that the troops were on their march from Boston. So the local leaders went back to Lieutenant Governor Oliver. And as he wrote, I was desired to go and intercede with His Excellency to prevent their coming. From principles of humanity to the country, from a general love of mankind, and from persuasions that they were this orderly people, I readily undertook it. He traveled east past the Lee House, the Sewell House, the Brattle House, the Vassal House. On the common, Oliver saw the crowd, and as I passed the people, I told them of my own accord I would return and let them know the event of my application. Oliver hurried through Charlestown to the ferry across the Charles. And along the way, at some point, he met another committee going the other way. These were Boston's top radicals. Now, Samuel Adams was off in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress, but a warning had come to Dr. Joseph Warren, a young physician. And this doctor later wrote to Adams, a billet was brought requesting me to take some step to prevent the people from coming to immediate acts of violence, as incredible numbers were in arms and lined the roads from Sudbury to Cambridge. For years, royal officials had blamed the Boston radicals for causing trouble, saying that they were inflaming the locals and riling up the country. But Warren and his colleagues wanted to stop violence, to calm the crowd, to keep the situation from becoming violent and fatal and possibly destructive to Boston. Warren wrote, I summoned the committee of correspondence, but as care had been taken to caution every man who passed the ferry from alarming Boston, I judged it best not to inform the person who warned the committee of the business we were to meet upon. They therefore took no great haste to get together. After waiting some time, I took as many of the members as came in my way to Charlestown, fearing that something amiss might take place. Warren went out with 5 other organizers, including the Boston town clerk. Dr. Warren was by far the most junior member of this team, and they were the men that Thomas Oliver met on the road. All of those gentlemen wanted a peaceful end to this crisis. So after discussing the situation quickly, they wished each other success and they went on their separate ways. Inside Boston, the lieutenant governor went to the Province House, the residence for the royal governor near Old South Meeting House. He met with General Gage and Admiral Samuel Graves. The Boston Gazette later credited Oliver for telling the admiral that the men in Cambridge were not a mad mob, but the freeholders of the county. General Gage promised that he hadn't sent any soldiers out against the crowd, and he didn't plan to. So Oliver prepared to head home, as he'd promised, back across the ferry. Meanwhile, on the Cambridge Common, Judge Danforth announced his resignation, saying, it was a great mortification to him to find the state lately taken by him so disagreeable to this country, in which he conscientiously had meant to serve them. And Judge Lee read out his new resignation letter. Lee also praised the crowds for how well they were behaving. This was a sort of public ritual, the elite showing respect for the people. Then the Boston organizers arrived at the Common. They tried rather clumsily to calm the people. One of them decided to treat this big gathering as a town meeting. A vote was called for, the Boston Gazette reported, to see if the body was satisfied with the declarations and resignations above said, and passed in the affirmative nem con, which was Latin for without dissent. It was then moved to know whether the body would signify their abhorrence of mobs, riots, and the destruction of private property, and that passed in the affirmative nem con. So you had 4,000 men with sticks declaring, oh yeah, we're very much against mobs, we are against riots. Now, there were still issues that those committees wanted to discuss. The Boston men asked the crowd to choose leaders. Now, the crowd had already chosen leaders. The Bostonians were really out of touch here. All the committees went into a tavern nearby to dine and confer at midday. And the crowd, which was still growing as more people arrived in town, they stood and sat out on the common waiting. There was still this social gap between the gentlemen who were part of these committees and the ordinary farmers. Some stood, no doubt, under the tree that later became known as the Washington elm because General Washington supposedly took command under it. There was a whole line of elms along the common at that point. After the midday dinner, the crowd heard another apology from Sheriff David Phipps, not for turning over the gunpowder and the cannon to the soldiers. The gentleman decided that as a militia officer, he had to follow the governor's orders on those. But Phipps had to apologize for sending out court writs under the Massachusetts Government Act. And the county clerk also apologized and resigned. So the gathering had accomplished one purpose, which is basically to shut down the Middlesex County court system. Around then, Lieutenant Governor Thomas Oliver arrived back with his good news that the soldiers weren't coming. Oliver said, "I was then thanked for the trouble I had taken in the affair and was just about to leave them to their own business when one of the committee observed that as I was present, it might be proper to mention a matter they had to propose to me. It was that although they had respect for me as lieutenant governor of the province, they could wish that I would resign my seat on the council." Oliver reproached the men for adding a condition to their deal. He argued that the lieutenant governors traditionally sat on the council, even under the old constitution. He argued that the thousands of men on the common in front of him still represented only one county. Ultimately, however, Oliver had to promise not to disobey the popular will. The Boston Gazette said, this seemed satisfactory to the committee, and they were preparing to deliver it to the body, to go out to the men and tell them what had been agreed. The gentlemen figured that they could persuade the crowd. The situation seemed to have been resolved. But by coincidence, the commissioners of customs rode past just at that moment on their way from Salem, the old capital, now back to Boston to work with General Gage. Those royal officials were the ones who had overseen the collection of the very unpopular tax revenues since 1767. The men from the inland towns probably didn't recognize those officials. Why would farmers know the men in charge of the customs service in the ports? But Isaiah Thomas, printer of the Massachusetts Spy newspaper, was out there from Boston, and he pointed out one of the most unpopular men, Benjamin Hallowell, riding by in his coach. Hallowell, in fact, himself reported, "No insult or affront was offered me until I came to where some people from Boston stood, who called out to me, 'Damn you, how do you like us now, you Tory son of a bitch?'" The Boston Gazette said, "The sight of that obnoxious person so inflamed the people that in a few minutes above 160 horsemen were drawn up and proceeding in pursuit of him on the full gallop." The committee men were able to convince most people to stop chasing those officials, but a few continued after Hallowell across the bridge from Cambridge into Roxbury. And another customs commissioner eventually wrote, "Mr. Hallowell narrowly escaped being taken. The cry was, 'Stop him! He has killed the man!' And when the chase grew warm, he got out of his chaise with his servant's horse and with a pistol in each hand, kept the people off and got safe to the guard at Boston." Back at Cambridge, people started to worry about soldiers again. Would Hallowell tell General Gage that he had been attacked and ask the general to send out troops? The leader sent light horsemen out to scout the roads. Now, even using the term light horsemen, that's a military term. It was a military tactic. There were no soldiers present still, but it was already, the situation was becoming militarized. Meanwhile, Thomas Oliver took the opportunity to head back home. "I chose to get out of the way," he later wrote. "I was just going into my carriage to proceed to Boston when a vast crowd advanced, and in a short time my house was surrounded by 4,000 people, and 1/4 part in arms. Some of the men had gone back to grab their guns again. I waited in the hall when 5 persons entered with a decent appearance, who informed me that they were a committee from the bottom of the people. The crowd had replaced their leaders with more confrontational men. The new committee had brought a paper for Oliver to sign. It called the Massachusetts Government Act a manifest infringement of the charter rights and privileges of this people. It ended with Oliver promising to resign from the council. Oliver reproached his visitors for ingratitude and false dealings. He reminded them that he had reached a deal with their colleagues, and the men answered, the people were dissatisfied with the votes of the committee in the morning. An Irish businessman was outside at the time, and he assessed the crowd. He judged those who were drawn up regularly in two lines were about 2,000, and that the bystanders were, I think, 1,000 more. There was no tumult, but an awful stillness, silence through the lines and among the surrounding body of people. The negotiations were not going well. Oliver absolutely refused to sign any paper. The men warned of the consequences of refusing the demands of an enraged people. Some people outside were pressing through the gate into the yard. Oliver saw people pressed up to my windows, which were then open. He could hear the men at the back of the crowd calling for vengeance against the foes of their liberty. The committee appeared anxious. They endeavored to appease the people, but in vain. Oliver heard the distresses of my wife and children upstairs. He made a wild suggestion. I proposed that the people should take me by force. Startled, the committee refused to allow that. And finally, Oliver surrendered to a point. He added one line to the resignation letter that the committee had written. My house at Cambridge being surrounded by about 4,000 people in compliance with their command, I will sign my name. The committee took the document out to the assembly. The Irishman said it was immediately handed along the lines and read publicly at proper distances till the whole body of the people were made to hear it, prompting a cheerful murmur or general universal voice of joy. But Oliver said that the committee actually found great difficulty in getting it accepted. I had several messages from the people that people would not accept it with those additions, upon which I walked into the courtyard and declared that I would do no more, though they should put me to death. I perceived that those people who formed the first body which came down in the morning used their utmost endeavors to get the paper received with my additions, but they were still not able to protect me from the insults which I received from those who were in arms. Only one force was strong enough to resolve that situation, the weather. According to John Tudor's diary, at 5 p.m. came on great thunder and lightning with a great shower, and the thousands of men dispersed back to taverns and to their arms and to their farms. That night, Oliver sent Gage a letter begging him not to send troops out to Cambridge, or it would prove fatal to him. By the next day, Oliver was back to Boston to stay, and his family came with him soon after. Brattle and Sewell were already in Boston when the officers came. A few days later, John and Elizabeth Vassall moved into town. On September 16th, Judge Lee secured a certificate from the Charlestown Committee. He was going, quote, on a tour through the country for his lady's health. So people should treat him with such civility and respect as shall do honor to our common cause. In October, George Ruggles made a deal with a Bostonian named Thomas Fairweather. They basically traded houses. Ruggles moved into Boston and Fairweather moved out to Cambridge. So that's why that house is called the Ruggles-Fairweather House. I'm not sure when the Borlands and Penelope Vassall moved out, but the owners of all those houses along the Watertown Road, except for Fairweather, were out of town when the war began. These changes reflected a new reality in Massachusetts. Supporters of the royal government no longer felt safe in the country, and the authority of the royal government now stopped at the gates of Boston. General Gage had troops in Boston and at Castle William, but he had no power anywhere else in Massachusetts. The rest of Massachusetts had risen up. Effectively, most of New England was freed from British authority from September 1774 on. Thomas Oliver and his family never returned to their house in Cambridge. After General Gage returned to Boston in the fall of 1775, after General Gage returned to England in the fall of 1775, Oliver became acting governor. Lieutenant General William Howe was really in charge of Boston under martial law. Oliver presided over a couple of meetings of the Mandamus Council, and then all the British military and the royal officials sailed away in March 1776 on Evacuation Day. Thomas Oliver settled in England, still wealthy from his plantations. Eventually, his wife Elizabeth died. He remarried and lived in the English countryside. He received his salary as lieutenant governor until he died in 1815. So Oliver served about a month as the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, about a year and a half as the lieutenant governor of Boston, and about 40 years as royal lieutenant governor in name only. In 1873, the local historian Samuel Adams Drake published Historic Fields and Mansions of Middlesex, and he applied a new name to the Oliver's old neighborhood, Tory Row. It was a nostalgic name for a place that had come to an end almost overnight 99 years before. So thank you. I did want to mention the Washington elm. There's a 19th century tradition that George Washington formally took command of the British Army, of the Continental Army under it. That didn't happen. Nevertheless, that story became immensely popular in the 1800s, and that reflected how historians and the culture liked to picture the scene, a general coming to create order and discipline and military hierarchy and all that focus on one man, Washington, the father of the country. I think Cambridge Common is really a monument to democracy. Thousands of men protesting to keep their rights, demanding that public officials work for their interests and not for the crown. That's what the confrontation of September 2nd, 1774 is all about. We're going to see the 250th anniversary of that event in 2024, and I believe it's an event worthy of public commemoration. And I hope to see one. I hope to be involved in one. I hope that folks in Cambridge will be part of that too. So thank you very much. I am happy to take questions about anything involving this presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, John. This is so fascinating. And I've seen a couple people in the comments saying they're going to have to go back and watch the recording again to really take in all of these really fascinating layered events. So we've got a few questions so far in the chat. I'm going to read some of the questions for those of you who posed questions that are a little bit more involved. I might also invite you to, if you'd like to take yourself off mute and ask them directly to John, we can do that as well. We've just got a few minutes. So let's start with Alan. And Alan's first question, John, was Jonathan Sewell related to Judge Sewell of the Salem witch trials?
It was, he wasn't a direct descendant, but it was a large family that had a lot of people in it. He was from another line. There were people who were more closely related and wealthier and more established with the last name Sewell.
Thanks. Another great question here from Jeremy, which was, how was the class structure the same or different in Massachusetts as the other colonies like Virginia?
Good question. Massachusetts was more egalitarian. The holdings of the large farmers were not as huge as in New York, where you had these great proprietors, or in Virginia, where you had really wealthy planters. Also, there was less capital in human terms, in terms of enslaved people. So that in general, although there was, more of a class structure than we would recognize today in terms of the gentility, and then the yeoman farmers, or the rich merchants in town, and then the craftsmen. Nonetheless, it was more egalitarian than probably any place else in the British Empire.
Thank you. Tom had a question or a comment about the treatment of Loyalists. Tom, would you like to chat with John directly, or do you want me to read it?
Sure. Thank you, Emily, for hosting, and John for your a very informative presentation. Can you please say something more about how Loyalists and neutrals in Massachusetts and beyond were intimidated and bullied into flight in the run-up to the Revolutionary War? It's covered in Maya Jasanoff's book, Liberty's Exiles, and Holger Hook, especially Scars of Independence. I put those titles in the chat for everybody. And my view is that I think that independence could have been won without terrorizing Loyalists to such a great extent. Thanks very much.
Okay. Physical intimidation had been part of the Whig or Patriot program since the Stamp Act protests in 1765. So it was, especially given that they did not have any authority over these royal officials being appointed from London, this was, they thought, their only way of expressing their opposition. They couldn't vote out these people because these people were not subject to vote. So there was intimidation and there's a certain amount of violence. Generally, the violence, the tarring and feathering, for instance, was directed against working class people and not the higher ups, not the gentlemen at the top, which shows some class deference. That changed a bit as the war arose. By late 1774, there was more violence being directed at gentlemen. There is a moment when somebody takes a shot at William Vassall's carriage, the member of this extended family who is not living in Cambridge, living elsewhere, out in Lincoln. Somebody shoots at their carriage. There's a rare example of gunfire at this time. Eventually, a lot of the Loyalists who have been appointed to the Mandamus Council were intimidated enough that they moved into Boston to be behind the army lines. And while there, they felt safe, and then they had to leave when the army left. And they, during the war, the Massachusetts government locked up some people for being Loyalists. They confiscated the property of a lot of the Loyalists in order to fund the war effort. And that meant that those people after the war were not able to come back, lost a lot of property, had to apply to the British government for compensation. So there were definitely some things that were what we would think of as unjust, which the people at the time felt were required by military, and first political and then military necessity. It is good to see that well, it's somewhat reassuring that the war was never as vicious and as it became in other parts of what became the United States, especially the Southern campaigns later in the war, where it was truly a very divisive civil war. And that's where a lot of the atrocities that Holger Hook and Maya Jasanoff and Cassandra Pybus and others write about. That is not to say that there were no what we would consider atrocities in Massachusetts, but one thing that kept that down is that Massachusetts, the Patriots were so overwhelmingly more larger, more numerous than the Loyalists, that the Loyalists really did not see any ability to resist by force, except through using the military, the Royal Military, or getting the protection of the Royal Military. So there was not really a civil war in Massachusetts the way there was elsewhere, because just one side was just so much smaller than the other.
Great, thank you for addressing that. And Tom, thank you for the question and the comment. I have one more question from Alan here. And if anybody has another quick question or two, do feel free to drop those in the chat. Alan also asked how many Loyalists decided to stay in Boston and Massachusetts and tough it out through the American Revolution?
That's an interesting question. A lot of the numerical questions about Loyalists, you have to define what a Loyalist is, because if you say a Loyalist is somebody who leaves with the British Army, then everybody who stays, even if they're still thinking of themselves as subjects of the king, isn't a loyalist. There were definitely some people, in fact, some fairly well-known people like the Reverend Dr. Mather Byles, who was a very prominent minister in town, Dr. James Lloyd, who stayed in Boston. About 1,000, a little more than 1,000 loyalists left in March 1776. More had left earlier. John and Elizabeth Vassall and their family had bugged out earlier during the siege. So I would say that overall there were fewer than 2,000 loyalists in Massachusetts who actually decided to leave the province. But there were others who just kept their heads down, decided to acquiesce, didn't make trouble. And the Reverend Dr. Byles's daughters were well known for remaining loyalists decades into the Republic, so that you would, if you were a tourist coming to Boston, you might enjoy going and visiting the Byles sisters in their rundown home in the south of the south part of the city, and hearing them talk about how they were still subjects of the king. So there were some loyalists who stuck around, definitely. I don't know, I can't tell you a number.
All right, well, John, thank you once again, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us this evening. Really, really wonderful to see so many people here in our virtual space again. We have lots more of these events and gatherings coming up on Zoom in the next several months, including our virtual summer poetry festival. So stay tuned. Stay up to date with the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, as well as the National Park Service. Thank you again to John. Thank you to the Friends and to all of you for being here tonight.